what a mess this country was in early in 1942. I mean, look what was happening. The Japanese had captured Manila and Singapore. Americans and Filipinos were being murdered on the Bataan Peninsula. The desert fox Rommel was running wild in North Africa. German submarines were so audacious that they not only came into the Caribbean Sea, but they parked themselves at the very mouth of the Mississippi River and picked off Allied shipping. Whenever I meet a member of the World War II generation, the question I like to ask is, was there ever a time when you thought we could lose the war? And they always say no. They couldn't ever, even in the depths of 1942, have imagined losing it. I wonder. Well, anyway, we responded militarily and culturally. The Doolittle raid on Japan, the great naval victory at Midway Island, and the obscure new general who was put in 1942 in charge of United States forces in Europe. Ironically, he had a German name, Eisenhower. And by the end of 1942, our buildup in the British Isles for what eventually, although nobody knew quite when, would become the invasion of Europe had started. There were new words entering the language via the military. Probably the most famous that we still use today is SNAFU, the great acronym for situation normal, all fouled up. My favorite acronym, though, is JANFU, which stood for Joint Army Navy Foul Up. And there was another addition to the language. You could see it on the sign outside a New Jersey butcher shop. Horse meats, it said, not rationed, no points necessary. And the name of the place was the Man-O-War Supply Company. Boy, that tempts your palate, doesn't it? And keep 'em rolling not only applied to tanks, but to your old car, which was going to have to act or last for the duration, mostly because you couldn't get tires. At that point in our lives, America's unanimity of purpose to win the war took a lot of bizarre forms. For one thing, the FBI and the Mafia formed a shadowy truce to control labor strife on the New York docks. Interned Japanese Americans on the West Coast, who, Lord knows, had grievances against the U.S. government, formed into fighting battalions and did yeoman service in Italy. Black soldiers who wanted to go into combat for the most part could not and were restricted to segregated supply and construction battalions, although some did. Former isolationists put on uniforms. Everybody responded. There were conscientious objectors. Many of them did not fight but became medics. And there were critics. Even then, there were critics of war policy. What were we doing in the Philippines in the first place? Why did American soldiers run away from the Germans at Kasserine Pass in Tunisia? Why does the government have to read my mail? But the critics were more or less overwhelmed by a huge surge, a cultural outpouring, symptoms of which were George M. Cohan dying in the middle of the war, and we sang his great old songs. It's a grand old flag, Yankee Doodle Dandy, with new vehemence. Baseball kept on going. The Cards beat the Yankees in the 1942 World Series, remarkable for the fact that there even was a 1942 World Series. An old Babe Ruth, long retired from baseball, came out of retirement to play himself in a movie called Pride of the Yankees with Gary Cooper playing Lou Gehrig. And that Christmas of 1942, Irving Berlin gave us both a song and a postcard when Bing Crosby sang, I'm Dreamin' of a White Christmas. Christmas, 1942. By 43, there were small vegetable gardens that were called Victory Gardens springing up in backyards all over the country, but especially in California, where many of the vegetables had been supplied by Japanese vegetable gardeners, now interned. There were women in the workforce for the first time in such great numbers, and Rosie the Riveter was their symbol. You know, she wasn't glamorous, and it wasn't glamorous work, although come to think of it, there was one 19-year-old aircraft assembly line worker who did find some glamour in it, Her name was Norma Jean Baker, and she came out of the war to make movies as Marilyn Monroe.